Greetings, students, and welcome to Chapter 6, Keywords and Concepts. We're learning about learning, yay! All right, I know, very blank slide, but it's all we had from this little section here. So, opening up, we should probably know the difference between an instinct and learning, because this is kind of relevant. So, instincts are innate behaviors that are triggered by a broader range of events, like hitting puberty or springtime, right? There are birds that are going to have instincts to go mate. There are birds that are going to have instincts to go find food. That kind of thing. That is an instinct. That is different than learning. Learning is a relatively permanent change in behavior or knowledge that results from a specific experience. So let's say those same instinctual birds had discovered a little patch of land which has their favoriteest food on it. That would be learning if they kept coming back to that same patch of land, trying to find their preferred food source. So that's the difference between instincts and learning. So moving into the conditioning portion of the chapter, classical conditioning. Classical conditioning is a process by which we learn to associate stimuli and consequently to anticipate events. So in your textbook, you read about Pavlov and his dogs and how he learned that he could condition the dogs to respond simply to a bell, not even the food, just the bell that came before the food, right? So a conditioned response is the behavior caused by an exposure to the conditioned stimulus. So when we're talking about Pavlov's dogs, they had learned to associate the tone, the bell, the sound, the conditioned stimulus, with being fed. And as a result of that, they began to salivate, giving a conditioned response in anticipation of food, right? So Pavlov figured out a way to take a response that something had, in this case, the response the dogs had to the food to salivate, and then he figured out a way to bring out the salivation without the food. That's the important part, right? Without the food. Speaking of conditioning, you also read about the little Albert experiment. I'm so sorry about that. There's a reason we have rules and ethics around psychological research now, as you're learning why. And the big lesson from the little Albert experiments was that fear can be learned, right? We kind of assumed that it was natural, that it was innate, that kind of thing. No, it can absolutely be learned. And this really does get borne out in people who are raised in an abusive household, that kind of thing. They very much learn fear, right? So moving on to something a little more pleasant is taste aversion. I said this was coming up. So taste aversion is a fascinating type of conditioning that we've probably all experienced, right? Have you ever had something that you absolutely love to eat, and then a couple hours later it didn't go so well? Something in it didn't agree with you in some way, you know what I mean? And whatever way it comes out, the next time you see that food, how do you feel about that food? Yeah, you won't eat it. And I mean, this has done this to me for decades, where I've had a bad experience with a food and it took me a solid 10 or 15 years before I would go back to it, right? And we are a little weird with taste aversion just because it is so remarkably, I don't know, intense? I think intense is the word I'm looking for. Like I said, 5-10 years. Research into this suggests that the reason it's so intense is because this may have had an evolutionary advantage for us to help us avoid bad foods, poisonous foods that would hurt us, right? So if, one of our primitive ancestors had figured out, hey, that berry makes me sick, and had stayed away from that berry because of the taste aversion in their genetic code, their children probably are going to do a little better because they weren't eating the poisonous berry. Okay? All right. I'll see you guys in the next video.